you guys.
Lovely. So I'll go for, it's nice to see some faces popping up. Yeah, so my name's Becca. Hello and welcome everybody. Our little plan for today, so we've got till 7:30. So there's 4 of us here today. So myself, Alex, other Becca or Rebecca and Paul. We're all trainees on different courses. So our vague plan is that we'll each just tell you a little bit about ourselves and our journey onto the doctorate. And then we'll open it out for questions. So as Jason said, I think probably the easiest way to do it is going to be if you can pop questions in the chat box, and Jason's going to monitor those. I think if there's anything that's not clear or something, we might ask you to unmute, but if you don't want to, that's absolutely fine. Yeah, so I will start. So as I said, my name's Becca. I have just started, so I'm a first year trainee at Plymouth University. We're in about like week 3 or something, very strange. My journey onto the doctorate, I guess, has been quite a classic one, I would say. So I did a 4-year undergraduate a couple of years ago, which included a placement in an IAPT service, which meant that it was I was quite lucky. I managed to get an assistant post fairly soon out of university. In total, I applied for the doctorate 3 times, but across 4 years. So the first time I applied, I read my application the other day. It's very bullshitty is probably what I'd describe it now. I put a lot of buzzwords in that I don't think are really understood. And I was very fortunate, actually. I got an interview off the back of it, but then at interview it was very evident that I didn't have much to back up my experience, so didn't go on. The second year I applied, I'd moved jobs to a different assistant role by this point, and I really put my heart and soul into it, and I thought it was the best thing ever, and I really thought I understood clinical psychology, and I got no interviews. So really felt that kind of disheartening, kind of I should be getting better. I want to kind of progress from the year before. And actually that year, so I at the time was living in Tunbridge Wells, and Salomon's, the Tunbridge Wells course, the Canterbury Christchurch, they moved their base to the end of my road. And I knew quite a few people that were starting. So essentially what I did was I ran away and I moved to Bristol, and I took a year off applying. I got a different assistant post. I was still working in kind of clinical psychology, but it was part-time. And then I ended up doing more community engagement work and working in the third sector. I'd worked with kind of homeless people. I did some work with the Scouts. I did all sorts that's more my values and still very relevant to clinical psychology, but it was outside kind of with clinical psychology, and I didn't apply for that year, so I didn't have the stress of the application process. And then that brings us to last year, where I thought, okay, I think I'm ready, I'll go through it again. And I did apply, and I was very, very fortunate. Actually, I ended up getting 3 interviews, got on 3 reserve lists, which was mildly painful, but then yeah, feel very, very grateful to now be on the Plymouth course. Yeah, so that's my journey. I guess my one bit kind of that I really took from it was that year out, having a break, focusing on my life, doing the kind of things that I wanted to do, and letting the doctorate take a kind of be less important in my life. That was one thing that I found really, really helpful. Yeah, so that's me. I think I'll pass over. I don't know who wants to go next.
I'm happy to go next. So I'm also called Becca. I have also just started, so I'm a first year on my 2nd week on the Oxford course. In terms of my journey to applying, it was kind of similar. I graduated in 2016 from Oxford Brookes. Was very conscious of how competitive the doctorate was beforehand, so I was trying to sign up for all the research opportunities and sort of all the mental health relevant volunteering opportunities as an undergrad, as much as I possibly could whilst working in retail. And then after that, I did a part-time master's, so it was distance learning, all online with King's College, whilst working for a mental health charity. So it was kind of, in my head, I was a bit like, well, assistant posts are kind of competitive. I applied for a couple, but my application would not have been anywhere near interviewable, kind of looking back at them. And so I was like, right, okay, let's get my foot on the ladder. So I did my master's whilst doing the support work at the charity over 3 years. And then in my sort of final year, I applied for assistant psychologist jobs, and I got an assistant post at a personality disorder and trauma service, where I was really, really fortunate. It was very, very therapy focused service, and there was lots of opportunity to develop and really hone kind of skills that you learn working in the charity sector. So I would really recommend it, because you see kind of the other side. You see the people who are on the waiting list and kind of the agony that that can bring, as well as then kind of when you go into the NHS system, see the reasons for the waiting lists, whilst being acutely aware of all the agony that they bring. And yeah, so I applied for the first time this November. I kind of thought of last November even, kind of thought of it as like a practice run. I wasn't putting too much kind of emphasis on it, because I was thinking, well, most people don't get on applying first time, it won't be enough. But put my hat in the ring, and I got onto the reserve list for interview for Coventry and Warwick, and I was on the interview list for Oxford. And then from there was absolutely no interview at Coventry and Warwick, but I was then 10th on the reserve list for Oxford, and was offered a place, having been 10th on the reserve list, which was a very stressful and drawn out reserve list wait. But yeah, that's kind of my journey so far, just kind of grabbing, I guess, as many experiences, but also really consciously waiting to apply as well. When I was doing my master's, I was very conscious of not applying before that finished, and trying to get as much experience in that time and use it as kind of a growth experience rather than the kind of sense of urgency of applying. Yeah, I feel like that was quite a whistle-stop tour of what I've done. But I'll pass on to someone else, and if anyone has any kind of more in-depth questions, then I'm very happy to elaborate. Who wants to go next?
I'll go. So hi, welcome everyone. I'm Alex, and I am first year here on the Sheffield course. So I graduated from my degree in 2014 and then stayed on to do a master's at the same time. But I think what's a little bit different about me is I never worked as a support worker. I worked at Costa Coffee, and I was a store manager with I had a team of 18 when I was 22, which was hell on earth, but also a really, really, really good learning curve. And it's something that I really wanted to reflect when I've kind of done my applications, that it's not just kind of the clinical world, it's also just you're working with people, you're working with differences, there's various different things. So having to like supervise, like I had people in my team who were a lot older than me, and having that kind of age difference to work with, but also people who were 18 and it was kind of the college job and they didn't want to be there, but I still had targets that I needed them to hit. So it was a challenge, but I think it kind of set me up for moving forward. So I had finished my master's, and then about a year later applied for my first assistant role, and it was kind of a half support worker, half assistant psychologist post. And it was, for me, that was really helpful, because it kind of gave me a little bit of a stepping stone into the care sector, but also starting to use psychological principles in my work, which I loved. It was challenging, but I really loved it. And then from there, I've had 3 more assistant posts across 3 years. So I've worked in CAMS, and I was really fortunate at that time to work in a family therapy team, and do a qualification in family therapy as well, which I think is something that's really not necessary, but it was a really good opportunity that I couldn't say no to, and also I didn't want to say no to. and it made me think about things a lot differently, and it was something that really opened my eyes. And I would say that as a person, I'm still not very good at reflecting, and how doing the family therapy course and even working in a family therapy team, I was kind of forced to reflect on the spot with families, and it was so helpful for me to have that experience. So I applied 3 times. The first time I applied, I kind of pitched it to myself. It was a practice run. I had nowhere near enough experience, but I wanted to have the experience. I'd seen the application and I thought, I'm not sure how I'd do this without spending a lot of time like looking over it. So my first year was definitely a practice run, and it was just kind of for me about how I would answer those questions at that time. I didn't get any interviews, surprise, surprise, which wasn't in any way shocking. But it kind of, each time it comes round to March time, when you hear back about whether or not you've been selected, it kind of almost lights a fire up your bum to think about, right, where do I go now? What do I do? And that's exactly what I did. I moved to a different service where I had a lot more I was a full-time assistant psychologist at that point, so I had a lot more responsibility in terms of my psychology work. And then again, I applied the following year, and I'd only just started in the CAMS team, and it felt, my application felt disjointed, because I was trying to talk about CAMS experience and I'd been in the team a month, and I just had no kind of basis for what I was writing. But I thought, oh, if I get these points, and it's going to look really great, and it wasn't. But again, it gives you that time to reflect afterwards and think, well, why do I need to think that these points are important? So the third time round, as I said, been in the family therapy team, and it had given me a lot of time to really think about what was important to me, but also what I was learning. And for me, the important, when I start my application, I always start with a list, and I'll do like a list of every job I've worked in and what I did in that job and what I learned from it, and kind of any feedback I'd got at the time, but also having a few different themes in my head, maybe 4 or 5 of things that I knew that I really wanted to get into my application that were important to me. So for example, when I worked in CAMS, I worked in Hull, and it's the 4th most deprived area in the country, and to me that was so important, because it's a different world to maybe what you come from when you're in university, and you're expecting so much of families who maybe haven't had the same like privileges and things like that. And that really like hit home to me, that it really depends where you're going and where you want to work, and those things you can't take for granted. So that was one thing I really wanted to talk about, and it was something that kind of was a theme throughout my entire application, of kind of this reflection on where I see myself fitting in the psychology world and what I think I'd bring to it. And I think, to be honest with you, I'm not really sure how I got an interview still. It's one of those things, I think you always kind of, for me, I will always doubt myself. But I know that when I read back on my application, you can see progression, and you can see from my very first one to my last one, just how much I'd grown and how much I believed in myself, I think, was in what was the difference for me. So this time round just gone, I'd got an interview for Sheffield, and then I was on the reserve list for an interview for Teesside, which it then came off as an interview. And I got a reserve place at Teesside, and then an offer at Sheffield, which I accepted. So that's me.
Fab, thanks Alex. So I'm Paul. I'm not a trainee. I qualified 2 years ago. So I've been working as a clinical psychologist in NHS Fife in Scotland, and the adult mental health secondary care service for the past 2 years. In terms of like my own sort of previous experience, I graduated in 2007. and worked initially as a support worker for a year in a supported living service for people with severe and enduring mental health problems before I took a job as a research assistant at Edinburgh Uni, which I did for 2 years until 2010. Alongside that, at the same time, just for my own interest, actually, I was doing an Open University postgrad forensic psychology course over the kind of 2 years that I worked as a research assistant. I then had a kind of brief stopgap as a family support worker for 3 months before taking an assistant psychologist job at the State Hospital in Carstairs, which is the sort of high secure psychiatric hospital for Scotland and Northern Ireland. And yeah, so worked there for 3 years, which actually is probably the kind of most valuable experience that I had, purely on the basis of, as a few people have mentioned already, just that sense of starting to develop that ability to reflect. I think the thing that's come through from hearing everyone else so far is just the importance of being able to reflect on our experience. So, and I think that was one of the things I'd noted down for thinking about talking on this webinar tonight, was just that, you know, it's not so much necessarily about how much experience, how many assistant posts we've had, how many, you know, whether you've had lots of clinical work, whether you've had lots of research work in itself. Obviously, you know, if you get a broad range, that obviously helps. But it's, I think, and this is my own view, so others might disagree, but it's much more about how we then reflect on that experience, what we've taken from that, not whether we can, you know, sit in a room and talk to someone, but actually how we reflect on what that means about us, what that says about us, and what we can then bring to the profession as a result of that. And as I say, for me, that experience at the State Hospital was really quite formative for me, and starting to get me to think much more about not just, you know, can I do a cognitive assessment? Can I go in and do an assessment? Can I do a risk assessment? But actually, why am I doing that? How am I doing that? What does that say about me? What does that say about the person I'm working with? Is there ways that I can do it differently? You know, so just starting to really get into that process of kind of reflecting on your experience. And, you know, I don't say that to say that you have to have an assistant psychologist post to do that. As I say, this is just, you know, from my own experience, that's where that started for me. But I think actually, you know, lots of people here, and from what I've seen of the kind of Facebook chat where this group started, or this webinar idea started from, was that there's lots of people already starting to reflect on their experience, even if it's not in an assistant post. So, you know, don't feel like you have to have one of those, you know, assistant posts, which these days are becoming fewer and further between, in order to be able to get onto the course. Anyway, I'm digressing already, so we'll come back to all that stuff, I guess. So after the assistant psychologist job, I did that for 3 years, as I say. At that point of kind of having that job, that's when I started to apply for the doctorate. I think overall I applied 4 times out of 5 years. Because what happened the second time that I applied was I got an interview with Newcastle, and it was awful. I absolutely bombed it, because I went in thinking, oh my God, this is so important. I really need to do this well. This is my career. This is what I want to do. And I was shite. You know, it was horrendous. I was so anxious, and I'd worked myself up for it so much that I just couldn't do my best at all. And actually, that's what came through in the feedback, was that, you know, you could see that you have experience, but it just didn't come through very well. So what I did then was actually kind of left the assistant job, got a post on the Clinical Associate in Applied Psychology course in Scotland, which some people might know as the kind of CAP course, or the MSc between Stirling and Dundee. I think there's a kind of similar role starting in England now, the clinical associate role. So that might be something that we touch on a bit later. So did the training for that for a year. So then qualified as a clinical associate, started to work, done that for 9 months. And just as I'd finished qualifying finished the training course for that, I'd applied for the doctorate at Newcastle again, and got on in that September. So then, yeah, done that for 3 years, finished in 2018, and I've been working in 5 since. I'm kind of conscious, obviously I'm the last one speaking. I've noticed that no one so far has put any questions in the chat, so this could either be a really short webinar, or you could be stuck with either me or one of the others rambling for, you know, the next 40 odd minutes. So if anyone does have questions, please feel free to either put them in the chat, or I guess if anybody wants to sort of ask anything based on what any of us have said so far, feel free to unmute and ask questions, I guess. If you would rather put them in the chat and not want to speak out, that's absolutely fine. I know that this is not necessarily my comfort zone either, so that's absolutely fine if no one wants to do that. But please do put some stuff in the chat if you want to. Is there someone there, sorry, who wants to? No, sounded like someone had on.
I could say something. Just in terms of the application, I mean, there's a pile of questions, but I'll just choose one at this stage. In terms of the application and the supporting statements, for example, and just using reflection to draw out those points that you want to put in the reasons how you feel your training is, how your work experience prepares you for training, for example, if you look at that question. Could you give a bit of an example of how you might go about doing that? So there's a lot of stuff you can put in there. You could fill it all with all the wonderful experience that you've had. But if you're taking it from a reflective point of view, just in order to understand that better, is there an example of that you could give? Or questions you would ask yourself?
I guess just off the top of my head, just thinking actually back to what I think Alex was saying a little bit earlier, just I really like that the process that she talked about kind of listing all your jobs and actually starting to put things into themes. I know, I mean, certainly as I've looked through, I think someone else had mentioned as well, I can't remember quite who it was, but that they had looked through their past application forms themselves. Now, in sort of preparation for this, I did that yesterday. My first one was absolutely awful. And there was no sort of sense of reflection, no sort of sense of themes, no sort of sense of kind of even structure or anything like that. But I guess as it's gone on, this kind of progressed. And I think some of the things that I noticed was more about, you know, what I've got for me anyway. So I can't obviously talk about everyone's own personal experience because it'll be different for everyone. But I guess for me, it was much more about, well, I've done lots of individual work. So what have I taken from that? I've done lots of kind of clinical individual and group work. What have I taken from that? I've done some research work. You know, what have I taken from that? And trying to come up with, rather than just saying, you know, really specific things like I can do cognitive assessments. It's more about actually, like, broadly, I've learned to work with people across a range of different client groups, a range of different populations. What have I learned from that? What skills has that given me in terms of my ability to develop therapeutic relationships, that sort of thing, rather than just saying, I know how to do a risk assessment, or I know how to do cognitive assessments, or, you know, if you know, as I say, I don't think it's necessarily that you have to have had that kind of clinical experience, but how can you take the experience that you've had and then generalize that into why does that make you a suitable candidate for psychology training? Does that help? I don't know if that really answers your question.
Yes, yes, it does. It's just such a short amount of space. And by the time you try and break down what you've done, then there's not so much room for reflection. So then it's how you balance what's more important.
Yeah.
Or do you know what I'm saying? Sorry,
Yeah,
I hope I'm being specific.
No, I think you're right. I think it's an art form almost, trying to write these application or these personal statements, because you have such a small word count, and it's such a kind of a process of trying to portray yourself in the best way that you can, but also to stand out and be unique. And I think that's something that's really important, because again, if the application form, to me anyway, if it just becomes a list of I've done this, this and this, actually there'll be lots of people who have done that and that, you know, who have done the same things. It's how you do that within that word count. And I think that's a real, skills maybe not the right word, but it's a process. And I would imagine, you know, every year that I'd written the forms, I almost handed it in like the day before it was due, because I took the entire length of time to keep refining it to get it the way that I wanted it, to try and, as you say, to get in as much of that balance between this is what I've done, this is who I am, and this is what makes me a good trainee, or potentially will make me a good trainee. But there's not, you know, unfortunately, I think this is why we're starting to have these, the conversation that we were having yesterday before the webinar was just about, there's not really a one way to get on the course. There's not a magic formula for it, which is why it makes it a bit tricky, because everyone is so different. Sorry, I feel like I'm kind of taking up lots of the time there.
We've got a few questions coming in on the chat as well. If maybe we could look at those, is that all right?
Yep.
Yeah, can I add one tiny bit on that question? A really good bit of advice someone told me: what you've done goes in where you put your jobs and your relevant experience. So there's no point repeating that in the supporting statement. So then the supporting statement and that bit of reflection can be more about what you've taken from it, what you've learned, and kind of what you've developed. But the content of what you've done, don't go, it's a bit different to like NHS job applications in that sense, I think. Yeah, that was something I really tried to hold on to, make sure that nowhere in my application am I saying the same thing, so that kind of you use every bit as well as you can. Yeah, sorry, but Jason, go on.
Can I just add as well? Just to go back to that reflection point. So, for example, one of the things that I'd reflected on was kind of understanding people's difficulties in terms of their own context of their difficulties, but then that made me reflect on my own values. And I literally, when as I was writing my application, not specifically in my application, I made a list of what I thought my values were, and then for example, I put, one of the things that I value is empowering others, and wanting to try and improve quality of lives for other people, which I know it sounds like everybody would say that, but for me, that was something that I felt was really important. So I made sure that I had the words in my word count to make sure I was able to put in somewhere within whichever paragraph it fitted in, that through, I think I'd put it in with, I was talking about engagement and formulation, I kind of banded a few things together, so I could kind of maximise my words, but that was one of the areas that I said, through having these experiences, it's made me think about my own values and how I bring them into my work and into the professional or therapeutic relationships that I've got with people, if that's in any way helpful as kind of a bit of a section for a reflective point.
Thank you.
I think sorry,
I
think quite similar to what other people have said, but when I started writing my application, the big thing which my supervisor at the time asked me, which actually did really make me stop and think about what I wrote, was why clinical psychology? So I did just do this big brainstorm and go, right, okay, I want to put across my passion for it. I don't necessarily need to do the tick box of, oh, this experience, but I did, in my reflection, try and kind of make sure I did have those kind of keywords in as well in my why, and how I'd kind of come to the why clinical psychology sort of thought process as well. Sorry, Jason, you can now organise.
Yeah, just because we've got a few questions coming through. So first question, and I guess this could be a question for each of you, is I'm wondering how to demonstrate reflection on the application. What advice would you give? So I guess on the first screen, I can see Alex is number one.
I think it's, for me, reflection, it can be a personal thing, but it can also be in terms of professional life. So I kind of wanted to, because doing the family therapy course had kind of given me so much perspective on my own life and my like learning things about me, I wanted to make sure that that came across in my application. So I'd kind of reflected on, as I just said, about relationships with clients and how important I find it to have that in relationship for various different reasons, such as, you know, having a proper therapeutic alliance and helping somebody with whatever issue they've come through to you for, but also for the services I worked in. So I worked in learning disabilities and CAMS, and it's most of the time a lot less about the actual individual and more about the wider system and kind of family members. So it's for me, that was really important that I got across that, but also saying that when I worked in CAMS, there was times there was a little bit kind of, for me, like, and I sat in supervision and said, you know, this feels a little bit close to home, and just having those conversations. And I didn't detail in my application what those close to home experiences were. I just said that through my experiences, I've had that time where it's felt a little bit touchy, and that I used supervision appropriately, or I kind of came away from it, and it's made me think about things in my life a little bit differently, but also not taking for granted what someone else is feeling, because I've experienced that myself, not wanting to put my feelings on them, if that helps.
Okay, thank you. And I just wanted to add with reflection, I think it's a term you hear a lot in this field, but it's not something people necessarily know how to do off the bat. It is a skill, and not every job people are currently in will equip people with that skill or really explain what it is. So, you know, I guess for the rest of you, when you answer that question, it'd be useful to get your perspective of what reflection is for you and, you know, how you develop that. Becca Sinden?
Yeah, do you know what, we had teaching on what is reflection end of last week, and it's part of me still thinks I don't know, so I might not be the best person. I think it's a really difficult one, because it can be a very personal thing, and it can very easily feel, or it did for me, just exceedingly self-absorbent, and like I was almost having my own personal therapy, and kind of I'd be in supervision and we'd be unpicking everything. And I think it was, in terms of the application for me in that supporting statement around reflection, what I did was do more what Paul was saying about earlier, and think about what have I learned. And I think particularly because in the 2 years preceding my most recent application, I had taken roles outside of classical clinical psychology roles, they'd really opened my eyes to many of the kind of social inequalities and more political issues, which for me then became quite a passionate topic for me. And I was able to reflect on bringing those bits of myself together and bringing that into clinical psychology, which I think is quite a hot topic at the moment. Yeah, so I don't know that I fully answered the question. But yeah.
Think about, how did you go about demonstrating reflection on your application? So you mentioned kind of what you've learned.
Yes, I think it comes through. I highlighted kind of some of my strengths and weaknesses, some of the things that I know kind of I really enjoy, and actually I didn't focus too much on necessarily where I learned them from, but what they showed me about the world of clinical psychology, the world of the NHS, the world of wider society. So I think it was pulling on those things that are important to me as a person. I think that was, for me, the way I demonstrated reflection. I didn't necessarily use a model particularly, or a framework. It was more what Alex said earlier around kind of themes that I felt were really important and inform my practice.
Right. Thank you. And then other Becca.
I think similarly to what people have said, what I did was quite a deliberate sort of thing of, after every point, I would ask myself, what did I learn from it? And kind of really, I was quite, well, I guess harsh on myself, be like, right, do you need this word? Is this word vital to the meaning of the sentence? But what I did, which I think was really, really good advice that I was given as an undergraduate by the careers service at the university, was every role I had, I just bullet pointed. I've got like a little book, and I just bullet point all my responsibilities or key things that I've done. So I went back through this book that I've kept since I was an undergraduate, and I put in their volunteering roles, everything. which is also really useful if you need to remember what your start and end dates are for employment. And I did just look at each thing and go, right, what did I learn from that role and how does that map onto this application? And I tried to do it in quite a, I guess, quite a pragmatic way. And I was trying to be really disciplined with myself and going, right, okay, if you've got a point, you need to say what you've learned from it. If that's not the point, and kind of really trying to draw it back to a reflective stance.
Thank you. And then Paul.
I suppose it's difficult to add much more to what the others have said so far. I suppose, I guess in terms of kind of learning to reflect, things like Kolb's sort of learning cycle, you'll find it on Google quite quickly, or I don't know if Jason, you can link folk to it through the chat. But stuff like that will help, I guess, in terms of like making people, or not making, but helping people to start to think about, what have I done? What was the situation? What happened? What went well? What didn't go so well? What would I like to do slightly differently next time? And it's just about getting into that process of starting to think that for specific situations, but then again, thinking about for the form, well, it's as kind of Becca Underwood has just said there, it's like, actually, I think I went through the form, quite other personal statement in a similar way, in the sense of saying a very short sentence saying, in some way, my experience of running groups, for example, and then, from that, this is what I've learned, this is what I've gained, and this is why this will help me to be a good trainee or to be a good clinical psychologist. And then, having worked with vulnerable client groups, this has made me think much more about ethical issues and stuff like that. And why does that then make me, why will that make me a good trainee or a good psychologist? So again, just kind of echoing what the others are saying, it's just that idea of, trying to demonstrate that through saying a very short thing. I really like that Alex, I think, had said earlier about, like, sorry if I'm getting whoever said it's wrong, because it's hard to keep track of who's saying what. But someone had mentioned the idea of, all the things you've done should go in your work experience section. So actually really just using that personal statement to say kind of almost the very short sentence of what you're trying to reflect on, and then using the rest of the words to actually say, well, what is it that you've learned from that, and why you think that's going to help you as a clinical psychologist. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Great. And then we do have a direct question to you, Paul.
I've seen this one, yeah.
Yeah, so how was your experience of the Dundee/Stirling course, and how did you find it beneficial now during your doctorate training?
So this is a tricky question to answer, because you're recording this and other people will see it.
As opposed to recording.
No. I suppose, I guess the reason I'm saying it's a tricky question is because I think it's been a really valuable experience for me. So essentially, it's a year-long course of learning CBT for primary care type presentations, and actually, the teaching is fantastic. It gave me a really good sort of solid grounding in CBT, which meant actually when I went on to the doctorate, the first 6 months of doing the adult mental health placement and the kind of teaching in that, it was almost like a refresher and a chance to kind of drill down a bit more into some of the stuff which for others it might have been a bit newer. The reason that I say that this is a kind of risky thing to talk about when it's being recorded is that I think there's becoming a sense that not just that course, but I guess there'll be similar courses like the kind of IAPT or the PWP type thing in England, that these things are a stepping stone to the doctorate. And that's not necessarily the case. So the clinical associate role is a completely separate role, and is not, it's not a pathway as such towards clinical psychology. However, I say that knowing full well that in a way I have used it as that, and that the experience that I got on that, was really beneficial for me getting on the course. And it's been really beneficial for me in terms of kind of career that way, and that I have a much sort of better understanding of CBT than I probably would have having just done the 6 months of it as part of the doctorate. But I am not saying that it's a stepping stone to getting onto the doctorate, because it's not. And I think actually that's probably one thing to mention is that I know this is a very specific thing for people potentially in Scotland who might be thinking of applying for that. although others might do as well. I think now they've changed it so that if you do that course, you're not allowed to apply for the doctorate within the kind of next year or so. You have to actually kind of give it a bit of time. I don't quite know the ins and outs of how that works. So it's to stop that sense of this is only a stepping stone. It is a career in its own right, and kind of should be seen that way. But you know, like any other career would be helpful for you working clinically for the doctorate.
Yeah, no such limitation with the PWP role.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got another question, which is: Are A-levels graded? Are A-level grades highly considered by unis? If so, which unis? Who wants to take that? Oh.
I think probably not me, because they don't use A-levels in Scotland, so I know less about that.
I know a little bit. Sorry, Rebecca.
So
Yes and no. It depends what uni you apply to. A lot, if not, quite a lot of the unis, if they have, if your A-level grades are important, they have quite a detailed, it's like a mark sheet that is usually available on various different uni websites. So you get points based on your different grades. So for example, I'm not sure about Bath at the minute, but Bath was a course where you'd be graded on your A-levels more so than your degree in subsequent qualifications. I know Newcastle is quite hot on the academic side as well, so they also have a scoring system. I personally have terrible A-levels, so it was something that I didn't want to chance applying to a uni where I was going to be scored based on that, because I just thought it's an absolute waste of an application. So that's all I know in terms of the two unis that use that, but I'm sure some people might know a little bit more as well.
I was going to say similar, that I know that Bath do, and I didn't know that when I applied, and my A-levels are also not great. What I did do was, in the sort of extra information bit of my application, just write a bit of context as to why they weren't great, because there was reasons why they weren't as good as maybe they would have been expected to, given other grades. And I just made sure that I really framed it in a positive way in terms of how it made me grow as a clinician, and how it's given me a different sort of perspective on things. But I would say, I don't know. I know I've got a friend who's just finished the Oxford course, and she said that they were looking at that, but the current trainees had the opportunity to veto it basically, and they shut it down in terms of, no, we don't think it's fair that people should be graded based on A-levels. So I think there's the potential that if courses are looking at it, trainees do have an option to kind of say, you know what, that's not okay, before it happens, which was quite nice and reassuring to know that there was people in the course who were kind of looking out for the applicants when they were doing those things. But I would just say check, and if they aren't great, then just contextualize them, because at the end of the day, I know if I was on the other side of it going into therapy, I'd want a clinician that had actually lived a life that was like realistic, rather than this sort of hyper brilliant person who had experienced no life trauma at all, because it's going to impact on sort of their understanding of things as well.
I think just on the flip side of that, I know that Lancaster is a uni that particularly focuses on you as an individual and your experiences, rather than kind of your academic ability and things like that. They're very much about you and what you can bring, rather than what you've done. So if it is a case of you feel on the other side of that, you feel that your A-levels are not that great, that's a potential uni to at least look at. I know that a lot of people really like the ethos around Lancaster as a uni.
Okay. So another question, lots of you mentioned the progression in your applications. What specifically was different about your successful year? Alex, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, sure. So I think this is really hard to try and pinpoint one thing, because I don't think it's one thing. I think for me, it's a lot less of using buzzwords or words that you think you should use, and actually using terminology that sits with you, as you would usually say it, but also things that mean things to you. So when, say for example, you can say, oh, I did this in supervision, and if you didn't do that, then you know that it's not believable. Whereas when it's something that you have really got an experience of and it really resonated with you, that really shines through. And it definitely did in my application. And I know when I've read some of my other friends, when they've written something and I've kind of just said, well, I know that you've worded it that way, but I'm wondering about that from my perspective. And they're like, yeah, it doesn't sound like me, does it? And I'm like, well, no, but it's your opportunity, it's your application at the end of the day. So I think, yeah, it's what I think it's that I just believed in myself a lot more, and I believed in my experience, and I believed that that it felt right what I was writing, and if it didn't feel right, it didn't make the cut. And I know, as you all know, the word count is brutal, so a lot doesn't make the cut, but it's about making the most of, there's very few words, and really wanting them to be there, they have a purpose. Every word needs to have a purpose, I think.
Becca, Syndon?
Yeah, so I think, as I've said already, mine felt more genuine this year, and some of the kind of more societal issues that I've become more interested in, I drew on them more. The other thing I did do differently, so my I don't have any postgraduate, I don't have a master's or anything like that, and I'm quite a few years since my undergraduate, and I didn't read my academic reference in my university. I didn't have a personal tutor. I had a supervisor for my placement year, and then someone else left. It was they didn't know me. Essentially, I've got somebody that does not know me whatsoever. And for the first 2 years I applied, I tried to get hold of her to tell her who I was, and wasn't able to, and I didn't really push it. This year I really pushed it, and I spoke to her, and I found out she had absolutely no idea what the clinical psychology doctorate really was, for one. So I really had to sell it to her, to say, look, this is what it is. I sold her my experience. I said, essentially, can you write these things? And I don't know how different her reference this year was to previous years. I've not seen them, but that's something I did do differently, and I feel a bit more comfortable with, knowing that it probably was more representative of me, and she actually knows what the course is.
But second, that I also did that with my clinical reference. So my supervisor trained on the whole course, which is very different, because you can go straight, you can only get onto that course through doing the undergrad there, so you don't need experience to get on that course. So he was kind of he'd never had to apply for the doctorate or go through the other courses, because he went through the whole route. So I literally sat down with him and said, these are the things that it asks, and these are the things that are expected to be part of it. I think on the Clearinghouse website there is a help sheet around your references, so have a look on there. And I made sure that I said to him, I know this feels uncomfortable, but this is important and it needs to be written in a certain way. And he went away and asked somebody else for help around how they've written their application references before, which again, I don't know whether that was helpful, but it felt important that references are really quite big, and I didn't want that to be something that kind of held me back.
Right. Becca Underwood?
I think just in terms of the question, in terms of progression in application, so I only actually applied once, but I think my progression came a lot from applying for so many assistant psychologist positions. I must have applied for probably about 40 before I actually got a position. And when I look at kind of my first applications for those roles versus my end applications when I was actually getting invitations to interviews, I think the key thing is, again, not just listing experiences or really kind of reflecting on it, and I think that there was a period where I was just really frustrated, and I was like, what the fuck is this, like terrible, like there's no spaces, how am I supposed to get this role? And I think that probably came through on the applications, and I think it probably came through on my first interview as well, that I was actually quite pissed off by the whole kind of experience at that point. And then I guess similar to the other guys taking a break from the applying for the clinical course, I took a break from applying for assistant psych roles because it was just mentally too much, and it was taking more than I was gaining from it at that point, and then kind of came back to it really refreshed and going, right, I need to completely overhaul this. I'm going to not just list things. But also I asked for help, I think is quite key. I did ask for feedback from people who've been successful in applications, and tried to take it on board. And because sometimes it's not particularly nice to hear, like, actually your entire form, whilst your experiences aren't nice, it's completely wrong for what they want to hear. But that's quite limited to the assistant roles. So I'm kind of aware of not saying too much. I guess that's a whole other topic to ask for help for when it comes to those things. But I think what other people have said in terms of references and reflection is probably really key as well for my roles with that.
Great. And finally, Paul?
I won't go back into reflection again because we've kind of covered that again, but I guess that was one of the things that is different. I did actually look over my applications just yesterday to see the difference between them, as I said earlier, I think. But I think part of it is about going, and this is where it goes back to this idea, I think, for me anyway, of about the art of trying to write these applications, because my first ones were very much, here's what I did, and I didn't know at the time of that idea of just having your work experience in the work experience section, so I was kind of using the personal statement to list lots of things I've done to say how fantastic I was. But then actually, as you get more sort of honed with them, they were going from being very specific about these other things I've done to much broader about the little statement about what I've done, but how that fits in the context of clinical psychology and how that's important in that context of that role. So again, the thing about, for example, working with vulnerable client groups, that then makes you more aware of ethical issues and gets you start to think about that. So it's how can you take your specific experience to the broader generalized sort of clinical psychology field. And actually the thing that I'd written down when other people were talking there was actually just as Becca Underwood has said, actually get support from other people, because I think as I've been talking about that, I was making it seems as though I'm saying, my application forms got better because I got better. The only reason that I got better at doing the applications is because I had a damn good, kind of group of people who were helping me and who were giving me some advice and supporting me through that. And I think that's one of the most important things. And that's probably the thing that was very different from me starting to apply, is that my first application was me on my own trying to think about how to do this and putting the application in. My fourth application was having, had 2 other years of people kind of giving me some advice, some tips, talking it through with qualified psychologists. Again, as Becca says, that depends on where you're working. I was fortunate enough to be in a position of kind of having that, and just having the opportunity to talk these things through with people to help yourself to put things down on paper. Well, I often find that, for me personally, that if I try to put myself down on paper and try to kind of convey who I am, it doesn't work so well. If I say it out loud first and then put it on paper, it comes across much better. So it's just about finding ways to kind of to do that in a way that works for you. But as Becca says, there is an issue about actually, the amount of the assistant psychologist posts and things like that. However, again, the Facebook group, Jason, that you'd set this up via, there's people on there who are willing to kind of to support applicants, and I know that certainly I've made myself known on Twitter to different groups as well, saying that I'm more than happy to do that. Obviously not for everyone, because I can't do that for everyone, but there are people now out there, social media for stuff like that is actually great. So if you are in a position where you're looking for that support, you're looking for someone just to talk things through with, not necessarily to review your application, but just to start having these conversations and start to help you think maybe in a slightly different way about your application, then there are people out there who are willing to help with that.
Thank you. Got a good question here. What is the one piece of advice you wish someone had told you when you were applying for the course previously? Alex, do you want to take the lead?
Sure. So this was a piece of advice I got the last year. So I went to Teesside Open Day, which was really, really, really good, actually. It was the only open day I've ever been to, but it was really helpful. And it was the director of the course there who spoke about making the most of the publication dissemination section, which I think kind of gives people a bit of the heebie-jeebies sometimes of not really knowing what you can and can't put in there. And she was really clear in saying that it's, for the Teesside course in particular, that's a really important section that they really look at. And dissemination is something that you do all the time and you might not realise you're doing it. And again, I used a list and I literally went through everywhere I'd worked, all the different research experience, or even things that you don't really think that's research experience, but it's still using those skills that you're learning. So it might have been just things like data collection and analysis, and keeping track of spreadsheets and various different things, which you might not think is much of a big deal, and you might not want to have an entire paragraph about it, but it is skills that you are using and that you've learned to use. So for me, that was really important, was having somebody say, just because I don't have a publication, but you will have used some techniques and research skills in your day-to-day work, whatever that may be. So make sure that you use that section and try and make the most of it so that we can read it and go, yes, this person has continued to hold on to some sort of skill following undergrad. So that was really helpful for me.
Great, thank you. Becca, Cinder?
I really like that piece of advice. Thanks, Alex. That's a really good one. I'm going to slightly do the flip of what some other people said, in that it's okay to kind of leave if you're in assistant psychologist groups or kind of really close-knit clinical psychology groups. I've had experiences where these people are kind of my friends and we get so absorbed talking about the doctorate, and actually I've not felt able to say, actually, this is too much for me right now. So there is kind of a negative side to them, and I know, like the Clinical Psychology Forum and the Facebook groups, there's a wealth of information out there that can be exceedingly helpful. But for me, it was being able to recognise in myself, actually, sometimes this information isn't helpful to me. I'm getting bogged down in it all, and actually I need to step away and say, look, I'm not going to come to the assistant groups for the next 6 months, because actually I'm just going to focus on myself and be really select about who in the clinical psychology world I'm going to talk to about my application. Yeah, and that helped me just look after myself. Yeah.
Except my group, you're not allowed to leave my group. No kidding. Great, thank you. Becca Underwood?
I think that's a really good point. To be honest, there was definitely a period around interview times where I'm not normally a very anxious person, and I was very anxious being in those groups, like the Facebook ones. I think I kind of mentally was like, I'm going to mute it soon, and then I got good news and I was like, oh, okay, that's fine. Like, but it almost hit the point where I was thinking, oh gosh, no, this is too much. I think in terms of advice, there's not something specific I think that I would have liked to have been told, but I did around kind of March time, I think it might have been on the Facebook group, about a thing called the DCLIN Psy Forum, and they were doing basically a day to help people get over nerves around interviews, do a bit of interview prep, and it was actually based in Matlock, up near Derby, and I just signed up for that, and that was probably one of the best things I did for myself in terms of preparing, because it is almost like you have the most anxious stuff and you kind of get it out of the way with, and you practice and you hear other people's experiences, and kind of are able to see actually you're quite different to the other people applying, and it's not going to be a case of, oh, who's got the most sort of cognitive tests that they've done or anything like that. And that was quite a good way of really calming my nerves. So I'd really recommend looking out for that if they do it this year. I think there was a cost, but the lady ran it also did say that if that's not achievable, then she was really keen to make it accessible for people who might come from sort of backgrounds that aren't represented in psychology, whether that's sort of class or sort of ethnic backgrounds. So I think she was very keen on making sure it wasn't just full of blonde white people like myself, basically. So I wouldn't let that be a barrier to it.
Thanks. And Paul?
Hang on, sorry. Actually, I was going to say something about interview prep as well. I am quite an avoidant person, actually, and would usually avoid doing interview prep and all those sorts of things. But actually, when it kind of come to the crunch, one of my supervisors pretty much forced me to do some interview prep, and it was the most helpful thing that happened to me. So I think actually, as Becca's saying, they're kind of getting over that, getting all that anxiety out prior to that, and also just something about learning to say out loud what you've been revising. I think, again, there's a huge difference between reading over lots of stuff and thinking about lots of things that you might answer it, but then when it comes to saying it out loud, it's not always the same as it's in your head, or it's not always the same as what you've written in paper. So just getting used to having that more conversational, that dialogue about actually why you want to be on the course and answering these questions. And I don't think you necessarily need, it's helpful if you've got a clinical psychologist or someone who's done that before to do that, but I don't think you necessarily do need that in the sense of just that practice of getting it out. There's lots of websites where you can get access to lots of questions that people have been asked that are similar to the questions in the doctorate that you can use to do that. I take the point that Becca Sinden had made about how unhelpful some of these groups can be at times, and it's, again, I think it is a bit of a balance, trying to know when it's good for you and when it's not. So trying to get some interview prep done and however you can. But I think the other thing that came to my mind there was not necessarily a piece of advice, but just remembering that even though it's competitive, you can do it. I went to a training course prior to even starting the application process, run by a clinical psychologist. And at the end of it, I was really eager. I was a support worker at the time. I was like, I really want to be a clinical psychologist. Can you give me any advice? And the advice that he gave me was, you're probably better off moving abroad. It's far too competitive in this country. The chances of you getting on, it's not worth it. And actually that could have been really crushing. But for me, I'm very stubborn, and my response to that was, well, excuse my language, but fuck you, I'm going to get onto this course. And I did. It took me longer than I thought. I made a plan, I made a 5-year plan. It took me much longer than my 5-year plan, but I did. And that's one of the things that it's very cliche, I know, but it's one of the things that I always say to people when they're talking about applying for the course, that the process is torturous, the system's not great, there's lots of things about it that we would all like to improve and we would like to do better, but actually, persevere. If it's something that's important to you, you will do it. And again, I caveat that with, yeah, it's important to you, but don't let it rule your life. And I think if I go back to when I mentioned earlier about that, my first interview at Newcastle, at that point, I was so wrapped up in it, so focused on it, that I actually couldn't perform well in the interview because it had become the be all and end all. And actually, when I took a step back from it, didn't apply the following year, took the time to go and do the master's course. Actually, just that time away from that process helped me kind of reevaluate it. And that's partly what helped me, I think, be less anxious about kind of going for it again. So it's not, as I say, not a specific piece of advice, but I guess just remember that, if it's important to you, keep going.
And I think based on all your answers, this really sums up the theme of, just really coming across human in your whole approach to the application, to the interview. And I think all of us who've applied and maybe haven't got interviews or have had interviews have all gone in the opposite way of trying to come across really impressive, almost like qualified psychologists. And based on some applications I've read and even my own, that the contrast has been that the person has been able to show what makes them unique.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's something really important in that, and also in that one of the things that, again, now I'm starting to think of pieces of advice that would be helpful, is that someone talked to me about, the importance of knowing your limitations, being human, being able to, even, and that includes being in an interview situation. So sitting in an interview, if you get asked a question, you're not quite sure the answer, it can be okay to say, I don't know the answer to that specifically, but this is how I would find out about it, or this is what I would do. And we don't have to know everything. It's just about being good enough, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah. And my last point is I just found it funny that the clinical psychologist took your money, then decided to give you contrasting advice.
Well, I haven't forgotten that.
And this is why I don't pay money for these events.
Yeah. It's also why I've got I got into such a rant on Facebook about these things, but that's another story.
Right. So we got another question. Not sure if this is a question that will be answered by all of you, but it starts: to any trainee, did you ask for help regarding your application form from your university's employability team? If you applied straight after finishing your BA, BSc or Masters, was it helpful? So I think this is talking about the employability support service that each university has, and whether you went to them for advice and support.
I personally didn't, but I think there's possibly a slight lack of understanding depending on the uni as well. I mean, I found, because I've got quite a good relationship with sort of the careers lady for the health and life sciences at Oxford Brookes, because I did quite a lot of advertising and careers events for her. And I think there's that real gap. I don't know if it's more specific to unis where there's not the clinical psychology sort of course up in the ether. But it's probably more likely that when you get on, they're going to be wanting information from you, because that seems to be the pattern that I found, basically.
And we've got a question that I think can be past or present depending on the individual. How intense was the training course? Alex?
So I'm only 6 days in, and so it's quite hard to say, but today we did role play for an entire day, which has been thrown in the deep end, I think is the best way to describe that. And it's something I was prepared for, in that I like to do quite a lot of reading. So I'd found old handbooks online, and I'd spend a lot of time like reading over the websites and CLINs and like all different things, and kind of got a bit of an idea, like the alternative handbook, of what the teaching looks like, as well as other things. So it wasn't a shock to me, but a lot of people in my cohort are feeling very overwhelmed straight away. I think there's a sense that it's something that we've obviously all worked so hard for. It's something that you kind of have on a pedestal, and then you're there and you're thinking, so you're just thinking, oh my God. So today I feel quite overwhelmed, which is not like me. I'm usually really quite chilled out and relaxed, and but yeah, it's a doctorate course. It's hard, it's busy, it's non-stop. You probably have to work in your own time to get things done. I mean, it's not gonna be easy, I don't think, but it's also a really great opportunity, and it's there for you. You're not in competition with anybody else. You're in it's your own race, and you do what you need to do to help yourself progress. And you've got, well, particularly on my course, there is so much support there. So I think I've got like 5 different people that I can go to for support that are all like linked to me, and I'm still thinking, do I need that many? But I know that at various different points over the next 3 years, I know that I've got somebody if I do feel a little bit maybe insecure or overwhelmed, or just kind of at the end of my tether. I know that there's that there. So maybe ask me again in a year and my answer will probably still be the same.
Becca? Syndon?
Yeah, I mean, similarly, I'm only 2-3 weeks in, so can't really comment much. I know at Plymouth they have cut down the number of assignments for first years, so I'm very excited, and hopefully that's good news kind of moving forwards. It's been really hard for me to work out what's the product of being on Zoom all day and what's the product of the teaching. I think it's so different this year, and universities are really struggling in many ways to work out what to do and how to work with it. It's new for everybody. So yeah, I mean, I can't really comment yet, but I'm sure it will be intense.
Becca Underwood?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in the same boat as Alex and Becca. I'm in my 2nd week, and my 1st week was basically a trust induction via Zoom, which was absolutely riveting. I think Looking at my deadlines, it looks like it's manageable at the moment, but I don't know. I'm kind of mentally going, what hobbies of mine can I like drop off or do less of if needed? But I think, like the others have said, it's via Zoom at the moment, and that I think really changes the nature of how it feels as well. And yeah, trying to work out what's Zoom fatigue and what's actually just information overload is a bit of a difficult line to tread at the moment.
Definitely. And Paul, who obviously had the more traditional experience with university and the doctorate.
It is intense, but it's manageable. I think I would always talk up the Newcastle course. It was a fantastic course. I really enjoyed it. I think probably like most courses, there are peaks and troughs. There are points when you feel really, really stressed out because there's so many things going on, and it's about trying to manage all those different competing demands. There are points when actually things go really well and you think, I'm on top of this and it's great. And I think that is really just a reflection of the clinical psychology career, because once you've finished the doctorate, that doesn't change. There are peaks and troughs where you feel really stressed and you feel like you know what you're doing, and there are, or you don't know what you're doing, sorry. And then there are other times when actually you think, yeah, I can do this. And then it changes the following week again. So I think it's more that you learn to get used to that than that it changes at all. But I mean, as Alex had said, you know, of course it's a doctorate. It is going to be difficult. I suppose the way that I've always thought about it was hard, but there was nothing that felt too unmanageable. The difficulty for me is always the fact that essentially you're working full time in the NHS and also you're doing a research degree, you know, so like actually you're doing 2 full-time jobs. You know, who else ever in any profession does 2 full-time jobs kind of thing? And that's the thing that I think is the tricky part, is that actually you're just always balancing different things and you're always moving from one deadline to the next throughout the 3 years. And I guess I think, you know, the only thing I would say about that is, and it's something that I've been really bad at and I'm still bad at, is planning annual leave, making sure you take breaks, making sure you don't necessarily let hobbies and things slip too much. Again, obviously there'll be times when things are busier and you might have to have a week or two where you're not doing so much outside of it, but it's really important that you do the self-care stuff as well, because it is an intense course, but it'll be much more manageable if you've got that balance.
Thank you. Got a question here. Do you think there is a huge variation between different courses? Thinking about whether to apply near to where I live, irrespective of the course, or if I should be more flexible to moving away from my home to find a more suitable course. Now, before you guys answer that, I'm going to plug in my little Excel thing that I made alongside another great member a few weeks ago. If you all want to take a look at that at some point, it's just listing the courses, talks about you know, entry level, what kind of entry level requirements there are, as well as the models of therapy that they teach on that course. And I think models of therapy is one thing you may want to consider when picking a course. They all do CBT as far as I know, but if you like schema, compassion, ACT, then it might be worth looking at that as well. But I'll pass it over to Alex, who will give a more in-depth answer, I'm sure.
I think this is a really personal question, because we all have our own lives and our own values and things that we want to prioritize. So I think the variation in the course, yeah, I think there is variation in some courses. Some places prefer to have people who have got maybe more research background, so that they kind of do less of that teaching and it's kind of already instilled in most of the cohort, whereas others that I've heard of don't like that. They just kind of like you to come fresh and be ready and kind and compassionate. What I found really difficult when I was applying was knowing the differences between all these courses, because I think like I said before, I've read so many websites and so many different things and they all sound the same to me, and after a while they all blur into one. So I really struggled knowing what maybe an ethos of a course was, and it was only when either when I like visited Teesside or I had an interview that I kind of got a bit of a a grasp on what I thought that was, and even then my expectations and reality were two very different things. So I don't think I'm very good at explaining it for answering this one.
Becca Sindon?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo Alex's. It's really hard to get a grasp of what the course is going to be like when you just read it on a website, or like the alternative handbook is amazing, and I went back through quite a few years because I think some of them, they get quite small samples, and you kind of have to think about that a little bit and how accurate they are, and courses obviously do change and do evolve. For me, I went quite location based, so I had particular areas. I was living in Kent when I first applied, and then, as I said, I moved to Bristol. So I've generally applied to lots of them across the south of England, not London. I decided I didn't want to do London. So for me, it was more on my personal life, and actually the 4 I applied to this year have completely different ethoses. And I have preferences within that, but one of the ones, so I think my ethos fits quite well with Plymouth, which is more on the social determinants of health and thinking about health inequalities and those sort of things, more contextual factors. But I was very close to going for, and I did apply, and I was on the reserve list for Bath, who are very traditional, kind of research heavy, kind of very CBT, very not on par with my thinking. And actually I spoke to somebody who was a first year trainee at Bath, who I'd met through the homeless centre that I'd volunteered with, and she'd worked in homeless services for most of her life. She hadn't really had many roles in kind of clinical psychology, and she'd had a lot of support worker roles and kind of similar things in that sector. And the one thing she said to me is, actually, she's learned so much about those things that aren't her strengths and aren't her passions, and actually what Bath has enabled her to do is to build and be such more of a rounder clinician, and really build on those skills that she thought, oh, I'm not going to bother about this because I like these bits. And actually she's found she really, really enjoys them. So I don't know if that helps at all, but I think for me, the ethos was less important than the location, but that is just for me. I know some people say other things. The other thing that I did change my mind with over the years I applied was which selection tests they use. So I don't know how true this is, but you hear that kind of if you do a selection test, it will just be that top percentage. They won't really kind of look at your application too much more than checking you meet the minimum criteria. And when I first started, was doing loads of stats tests, and I thought, I've got an undergraduate degree, I've got an okay knowledge, I'll revise, I'll be fine. I never got an interview from them. And there was things in them I'd never heard of. They were so out of my kind of knowledge base, really. And this year was the first year I applied to some that used the general mental ability tests, so the deductive reading and verbal reasoning. And actually I got interviews from all of the ones that I did that with. So I found that actually my strength was in those tests. And I always applied to a couple with a test and then maybe a couple that didn't have tests, to try and kind of spread your eggs a little bit. And because you never know, that one day for a test is a lot of pressure, I think, for that, if it's for a couple of universities. Yeah, so that's kind of how I approached it.
Right. And Becca Underwood?
Yeah, I mean, my choice of courses was pretty much mainly location based. I think the key thing that I kept in mind when I was applying was actually, I have a life outside of clinical psychology, and do I want to uproot it? And my partner, who's got a job in Oxfordshire, to I don't know where, like wherever would take me. So when I applied, I was very much looking at things that were commutable, or I did also apply to Bath, which is a little bit out of where I would consider to be commutable. But I basically applied there on the basis I could get somewhere and live part-time in Bath, and it was quite pretty. I didn't really have a huge amount of logic when it came to like the course ethoses. And I did also in my mind have, I don't want to do selection tests. Not necessarily, I don't know how I would do on them, but I did kind of think, do I want an added layer of stress in an already stressful process? And I thought, you know, if I'm going to do this process actually needs to work for me rather than me be working for the process. And, you know, if I'd been offered a place in Bath, I would have 100% gone, right, okay, well, I've got to make it work now. But it wouldn't have felt like going to Edinburgh every week and back again. It would have felt achievable within what I'd kind of signed up for. So I think yeah, just I suppose check in with yourself and sort of ask how much is the course going to interfere with my life, because you are people who've got so much more going than just clinical psychology applications. So I think that's really important to keep in mind when making those decisions.
Right, thank you. And Paul?
Sorry again. Yeah, pretty much the same as the others. That it was less ethos driven and much more about geography. And so I think when I'd gotten onto the course, that my little boy had just started nursery. So the idea of kind of uprooting everyone and doing that sort of thing was not possible for me. So I did what you might find lots, it might be stereotyping here, but lots of the Scottish folk do is they'll apply to the two in Scotland and then the next two closest, which is usually Newcastle or Teesside, or maybe the kind of Lancaster on the other side. So yeah, it was very much more that driven. As I guess I do want to kind of give the psychologist answer and say, well, it depends really though for everyone, and like, you know, you think about your own circumstances. If it's really important to you that you're the kind of course marries up with your values, yeah, if you want to move away and do that, that's fine. What I would say though is actually you've got an entire career after those 3 years to do things that match up, you know, specifically more with your ethos and your values. So actually don't feel that taking something based just on location because practically it's easier is any less kind of substantial than kind of moving away to do the course that fits with your values. And again, that's why I say it depends, because yeah, you might then not enjoy it because it doesn't fit with your values. But as I say, equally, actually, you know, it might be the thing that you need to do for that short period of time. And what can get you through it is knowing that once you've qualified, actually you can then train in whichever model you like. You can work in different areas. You know, you can do lots of different things once you've qualified. So don't necessarily be put off by either location or ethos and things like that. I don't know if that helps or just muddies the waters even more, but it's just something to think about.
Great, thank you. Now, we haven't had any additional questions, but I've got a few bits that I'm conscious people haven't really touched on that I'm hoping maybe people will find useful to discuss. You've already talked about one of the questions around dissemination, the main question as well. There is a question that I always personally found a little weird and off-putting, was that question on, you know, your hobbies and things you do outside of psychology. And I think there's a real pressure to really try and impress people by saying things like, oh, I'm Batman at night and I'm a millionaire in the day. So it'd be interesting to see how you guys approach that question. If Alex, you want to take the lead on that one.
This is my absolute favourite question. I really like it. And for me, it's an opportunity to show a bit of my personality and kind of, I put a little bit of humour in there. So whether or not anyone laughed, who knows, but I put it in there. So I teach people with disabilities to water ski. So that is always a solid thing to lap into that section. But also that I water ski in my own time. So it was kind of, I was able to start with that that's what I do. And I think people feel pressured to write things that make them sound like a good person, or that make them sound like they live and breathe psychology in and out of the day to day. And I was really conscious when I wrote this that I didn't want it to sound like I was using it as an opportunity, as an extra section to go into kind of my experiences. But I just kind of, I did use it as an opportunity to reflect on it's my time, it's my self-care time, it's things that I do because I want to do them and because they mean something to me. And it's, for example, going water skiing, I do that with my family, and that's family time. It's something we've always done. And the plus side of that is I get to help people, which I've done this since I was 4. And so I was like, it's something that I've grown up doing. So, and that's really shaped my life. It shaped my values. It shaped probably the reasons why I've come into this area, and I didn't want to miss the opportunity to share that. So I put it in and said, I literally said that working with this charity since I was 4 with my family has made me who I am, and has kind of given me a different insight into various different things. But yeah, I say make the most of it and just kind of be yourself. Like, don't be afraid to if you like to like do knitting, tell them that. If you like reading, tell them. Like, they want to know that you are human and that you've got that you prioritize yourself at the end of the day and the things that are important to you, I think, is my interpretation anyway.
Great, thank you. Becca, Sindel?
Yeah, I mean, I would completely echo what Alex has said. I don't know quite what they're wanting from that question, but my understanding is that it's just to say, who are you? And I think I have had an interview, sometimes people say, anything about you want to tell us, like anything about you, not psychology. And I'm quite flippant, particularly when I'm put under pressure, and I've made some hideous like dad jokes during that time, which I don't know if they've ever worked, but it's something different, I guess. I've just found mine now, actually, and I put a lot about, so guiding and scouting has been a massive part of my life, and I just rambled on about that. So I don't know how helpful that is as advice. I don't know if that's the right thing to do, but I think definitely, yeah, just put a bit of yourself and what you like.
Great, thank you. Becca Underwood?
Yeah, I think what other people have said, it's a chance to show them who you are, and also use humour. I've got quite a specific memory of writing mine, and I do kickboxing, and I wrote in it something like, oh, there's nothing like de-stressing at the end of a week by kicking someone in the head. And my supervisor read it and she burst out laughing. She went, you need to remove the head action, because that's a bit too forensic. But I've got quite a dark sense of humour. So I personally was writing it going, haha, this is funny. And then afterwards I was like, yeah, actually, maybe I did need to tone it down a bit, because in the head is quite violent. But just, yeah, use it as an opportunity to say what you like to do. Tell them that you go out to the cinema with your friends if you don't have anything specific that you kind of do. Like, okay, there's definitely moments in the past where I would have read it and gone, oh my gosh, I do nothing. I study and I work and I eat and I sleep and that's it. But they also want to know, that you enjoy catching up with friends, or that you have a life outside of sort of trying to get onto the doctorate, because I suppose in a way it's their way of checking that you're going to survive the process. If things get stressful, you've got those self-care mechanisms in place. Which is kind of what I took from it when I was doing it. And yeah, but don't say in the head if you do kickboxing and like to kick people at the end of the week.
Just temper the humour with the reality. Paul?
Just quickly, I guess just as Rebecca Underwood saying there, that I guess there's something about using that space to demonstrate that you know the importance of having a good work-life balance. And actually, I think I just had a quick look at mine there. I talked about the fact that I love to cook, and I really enjoy nothing better than spending 3-4 hours learning to make something new, and then sitting eating that with my family. So I don't even think it doesn't have to be that you've got some fantastic, really unusual hobby that you do. I think it can just be about what it is that makes you happy, but that as I say, it's about kind of showing that you have got that awareness that there's more to life than psychology, and what things you need to do to de-stress, and can show that you can manage that work-life balance. Because part of the thing about the training course is that, as I said before, it is really stressful at different points, and there's lots of different demands on you. So have you got other things that you can do? I think that's quite important to get that across.
Great, thank you. I am conscious of time, but we do have another question, and I think there were just 2 other areas I thought we would be worth touching upon for the crowd, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So we got a question from Sham. Please advise on how to answer the question. Your understanding of the role of the clinical psychologist within mental health care systems. And for me, I think that really touches upon the kind of question of what does a clinical psychologist do, and the role of it as well. So who wants to take a crack on that one? Without giving the answer directly, obviously.
Yeah, I suppose that I'd noticed that and was thinking, actually, I don't want to give a kind of very direct answer to that. But I suppose, the role of a clinical psychologist is really, really varied, isn't it? That, some services you'll be doing direct work, some services you're doing lots of indirect work, working more with staff or families. There's always the kind of service evaluation research component in the role. I think a lot of the time you're trying to communicate psychological information and a psychological understanding within a very medical system, and that's a big part of that job. Yeah, I guess the difficulty with that is it's really broad, and there, you know, depending on which area you're working in, it's going to look slightly differently. So yeah, I think you're right. You could say, like, what does a clinical psychologist do, and just really apply that to it. But it is really broad, and I don't want to necessarily give a specific answer that's part of the questions.
I think my advice would be to maybe look up any job vacancies that are going for clinical psychologist role, take a look at some of the duties and think about how that might be important within that service, and maybe look at other roles and just get a bit of a varied idea.
I think there's the kind of core competencies, if you Google them as well, that'll kind of give you a bit of a basis of what clinical psychologists do. Doesn't mean they necessarily do every single one, but it's kind of where the training kind of sits. And then it depends kind of on the service and the need of the client group, really, as to which of them competencies kind of used more frequently.
Great, thank you. So I guess the final bits then, and then we'll end it, is obviously, from the sounds of it, some of you here had your fair share of rejections with the application process, and I think that's something we've all felt. And maybe some people here, it'll be their first time, others it's been a few. So how have you kind of managed that rejection and built on from it? Because it's very easy to kind of give up from that point.
It hurts. It does hurt. There's no getting away from that. When you get the rejection, it does hurt, because, you know, like I've said a few times, it's very competitive. Everyone who's going for it is putting lots of effort into it, and to find out that you didn't get on does hurt. You know, there isn't any getting away from that. I think for me, actually, I know what I'm like, that for any job or anything that I've ever went for, I have a few days of kind of moping around, feeling a bit sorry for myself, and then thinking, right, okay, do you know what? Now I'm in a kind of better place a few days later. There's a bit of distance from it, and thinking, right, okay, again, goes back to that idea of starting to reflect, doesn't it? That you start to think, well, what was it that didn't go so well? Is there anything particular that I knew didn't go so well? What can I do differently? But I think the important thing as well is that asking the courses for feedback. And I think that was one of the things that was really important for me. I went for that first interview at Newcastle, totally bombed, got feedback, which was also really hard to take, to be honest, because it was very good feedback, but it was very specific feedback as well. So when I then read it, I was like, oh, okay. But then taking that feedback on board, not seeing it as a kind of personal criticism, and then think about, well, what can I do, you know, differently over the next year, to whether it's gain different experience or what that is, what can you do to try and strengthen and improve next year. But balancing that, as I say, it does hurt, but try not to take it personally, because it is such a competitive field that, you know, not getting that rejection letter doesn't mean you're not good enough, because there are so many people, I think, who are good enough, but there are so few places. So it's trying to kind of hold that in mind, that because you get that doesn't mean you're not good enough to do it.
Okay. Anyone else got anything they want to add on to that?
Yeah, I completely agree. Do you know what it is? It's not just the rejection, it's the god awful wait from application going in to March, when you start finding out, and then that's when anxieties start kind of flaring, and people like, have you heard, and you're like, no. And it's true, it hurts. I think for me, it's easier said than done, but I always try and have like a kind of a positive message or positive take home. So it might be, well, it wasn't the right year. I mean, this situation, these things are happening. Everything happens for a reason, and you might not know that reason at the time, but then it kind of then sometimes comes up apparent afterwards. It might be you get a different opportunity, a different job opportunity, in which you end up learning so much more, or whatever it may be. But also, if you've got the opportunity, but also not just having time to talk to somebody about how you feel, but also what you think you need to do for the next year, because you find out in March whether or not you've got an interview, which gives you a solid amount of time to go, right, what do I need to strengthen my application and to make me a better candidate for next year, or whenever you choose to apply, and just kind of almost take control of that. If you're in a job where you've got the ability, which I know that a lot of people don't if you're not in an assistant post, but I was quite lucky to be in a job where I could go, these are the things I'm missing, these are the things I think I need to work on. Can we try and make some of these things happen? Am I asking too much? Am I putting too much pressure on myself? And just having that time to talk, but also just being able to write things down and kind of write down how you feel at the time and then go back to it eventually. And I do it now where I'll read things from when I was applying. I was thinking, God, did I really feel like that? Because it doesn't last, the feeling, as much as you think it does. It fades when you get your head back into doing whatever it is that you're working on, or you're doing outside of work. Just look after yourself, I think, is the key. Like, use your support systems around you and have a good cry, get it out, like, feel sad because you've worked hard for it. And like Paul said, like, it's so competitive. And I think the hard thing for me was not knowing where you sit on the scale. So are you like, say they're interviewing 60 people, you might be 61, or you might be 70, or you might be 329, and you don't know where you are on that kind of scale to benchmark yourself. And that was always really hard for me, because I'm thinking, I know that I can do this, but do they know I can do this?
Thank you. Anything else anyone wants to add before final words? Okay, so any final words then?
Do drafts, do loads of drafts, give yourself time. Don't just like don't feel pressured to submit straight away. Like, give yourself time to write, and then come back to it maybe a couple of days, maybe a week later, so you've got time to reread and see what your sentence structure's like, or if your grammar is okay, or even just simple things like that. Like, you might come back to it and think, oh, that wording's a little bit off, or whatever it may be. Just have some drafts, plenty. I had about 5 or 6, I think, and that was just like my main ones. I had, like, I don't know how many times I wrote each paragraph out and rewrote.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Becca?
I would echo that, to be honest. Like, occasionally if I read something, I try and read it aloud, and then if I find my tongue kind of getting twisted, I'm going, right, that's not going to make sense to whoever reads it, even though it makes sense to me. But I think also, if you do get other people to read through your statements, just be aware of how many people you ask, because the chances are, I know if someone hands me a statement and I think it's really good, I might still feel a bit of pressure to say something, just because otherwise it might not feel like I've actually given them any feedback. Or if I say, well, it's amazing, and then they don't get an interview or they don't get on, it might be a bit like, oh, well, it was my fault because I didn't say that they needed to say this really minor thing on their statement. So I suppose just really, if you do give your statement out to people to look at and feedback on, just be really conscious of how many, because if you give it to 10, you're probably going to have 10 different people telling you 10 different things, and just kind of try and, I suppose, filter out the quality of the people that you're giving it to rather than the quantity. I know I've had quite a lot of well-meaning colleagues when I was applying offering to read it, and it would have actually been sort of really unhelpful if I'd given it to everyone who had offered.
Thank you. And then got other Becca.
Yeah, I was just going to say, boundary your time. Like, I think it's so easy for this to become everything and all absorbing, and like, get people around you that aren't involved in clinical psychology, but that you can say, look, I'm going through this really tough thing. Can have a moan at you? Can I have a vent? Like, use those people that you have, your family systems, your friend systems, and kind of say, right, I'm not going to do that for now. I found it really hard during the interview when you kind of refresh your emails. That period of time for me was that spring, and particularly this year, I think, with lockdown and everything else, was really, really tough, and I did not heed my own advice. But I vented like mad at my other half, and he got it all. And that did help. And then I was able to, focus on other things. And I think my thing now, being on it and being on the other side, I don't feel like I'm on the other side, is that if I think how I was a couple of years ago when I applied, I would find the material and the things we're being taught so much harder to understand. I think there is a reason why having that much more experience helps you get on, because I listen to the lectures and I can engage in them in a level that I would not have been able to do previously. So I'm hoping it's going to make the next 3 years a lot easier than it would have been if I got on before now.
Okay, and finally, Paul.
I guess just echoing the things that the others have said, you know, seek support from others, but like everything in psychology, it's a balancing act. So you want to ask other people for some advice, but you don't want to kind of get yourself too clouded by asking too many people. I guess the thing is, remember, it's always just suggestions and feedback from others. You don't have to actually put it into your form. It's whatever works best for you. So use people to help you to think about what's best for you, rather than getting them. As I said, I think, Jason, you and I had this conversation about, I don't like that sense of me being a reviewer of someone's form, because I'm not an expert. I think that the other person's role in looking at someone's form is to help them bring the best out in themselves. So if my suggestions don't fit with what that person wants, then they don't put them in. But at least that conversation helps to get them thinking about what is best for them. So, you know, seek that support from others. Don't lose hope. Don't lose hope at all, and look after yourself.
And I guess for me, just to kind of add, as someone who has had a few interviews and not quite gotten on, to keep an open mind and try and enjoy the journey, rather than look at it from, I'm going to do this experience from A to B. Really just try and enjoy what you're doing in the here and now, and keep an open mind to it. I'm not on the training yet, but I have gotten onto the CBT training. I think, if anything, that's something I'm really enjoying at the moment. And that's something I feel will make me a better clinical psychologist when I do eventually get on. So don't lose heart with it.
Yep.
As well. And I just want to thank Alex, Becca, and Paul for spending the time this evening talking to us. I hope you all found it helpful. I have recorded it. I'm going to check to make sure it's all recorded okay. If it has, I will put a link to like a Google Drive or OneDrive on the Facebook group, so you can revisit it then. But I've never recorded on Zoom before, so this will be a test as well. But thank you for coming, everyone.
Thank you all. Thanks for organising it, Jason. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck, everyone.
If the facilitator just want to, oh, one of them already left. That's okay.